Hello, everyone. Last week, our lessons were focused on the 4 natural regions of Texas, so I want to start there with a quick review. Here's a map showing the 4 regions, and I'm going to ask you to name them as I go around. We're going to start here from the west and move to the east. So, what is the name of this smallest natural region in Texas? That's correct, mountains and basins. As we move further to the east, we get this area that stretches to the top, the panhandle of Texas, and here into the central area of Texas. What is the name of this region? Great Plains. And above that, here in the north and center, I've just given you a hint, North Central Plains. And then finally, the largest of the regions in Texas, the one with the largest population as well. These are known as the coastal plains. That is correct. Okay. So, as we look at these, I want you to make some predictions in your head or out loud about things like housing, clothes, food that might be available to people not today, because modern conveniences and modern inventions have made it where there's not necessarily a lot of differences today, but back before we had electricity, back before we had any kind of machinery, if you lived here on the coastal plains, what might you do in order to be able to eat? Okay. If we were in class, I hope I would be hearing things like fishing, or because we know it gets lots of rainfall and has good soil, farming, possibly hunting, looking for wild plants and berries. And you would be correct if you said all of those things. On the other hand, we know the mountains and basins region is very different from the coastal plains. So, what kind of food might you get out here? Okay, probably hunting again, but it might surprise you that there was some farming going on out here as well. And that's because of this, the Rio Grande River. So the Native Americans who lived in mountains and basins were able to be farmers because they were able to utilize the water from the river. They adapted to the area, but they also adapted the area to their culture. And that's really what we're going to be looking at as we move forward to our lessons on Native Americans. Here on the Great Plains and the North Central Plains, you might predict that they have a somewhat similar way of life. And in some ways they did, but there were also differences because here in the North Central Plains we get a little bit more rainfall, so you might find it easier to be a farmer than here on the Great Plains. Sorry. On the Great Plains, of course, there were a multitude of buffalo. Do you think that might make a difference in how these Indians, Native Americans, would live as compared to these Native Americans? What you'll find as you study, though, is that the buffalo were actually all over Texas. And so all of the tribes that we look at were somewhat affected by hunting the buffalo, but not in the same way that the Plains Indians were. So the lessons that we're going to be learning this week are going to focus in on the people who lived in Texas first, the Native Americans. Now, this map kind of shows a simplified version of the different tribes who were here in Texas. Okay, we have a tribe called the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, the Jumanos, Cohiltecans, Karankawas, Attakappans, Tonkawas, Caddos, and Wichita. Here, this map shows that it's a little bit more complicated than just to say, hey, this is where the Comanche live. The Comanche actually came in later than some of the other tribes, and when they did, they displaced them. They moved them off of their lands. And so then the Apache began to kind of move here into where the Jimano had lived, or down here where the Cohueltecan lived. The Native Americans of Texas and really of the Americas were kind of in a constant state of flux, with one tribe moving in and living there for a while, and then maybe another tribe coming in and pushing them out. Some, though, lived in the same area for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so as we look at that, you'll see those people perhaps developed a different culture because they were in one place for so long, as opposed to someone who came in and was just newly arrived. So here we talk about the idea that this was the Kiowa land, but to some extent they shared it with Comanche because they had a very similar culture. And you'll notice as you look at the rest of the map, you have several of those tribes that are not over here, and that's because they were kind of a conglomeration, that what we call the Wichita also included some other people groups. Today, there are some Native Americans still living in Texas, but many of them were pushed out by the arrival of Europeans to Texas. And so you will also look at or learn about why some of these tribes have disappeared or where they went. So, what will you be looking for? Well, first of all, instead of focusing on the 10 tribes, we're going to focus on the culture region. Today, you will be focusing on the Western Gulf and the Southeastern culture regions by looking at one tribe. You'll be reading about and watching videos over the Karankawa as the representative tribe for the Western Gulf, and you'll be looking at videos and reading about the Caddo as the representative tribe for the Southeastern. That doesn't mean that the Wichita and the Atakapa were exactly like the Caddo, but it does mean because they lived in the same area, they tended to have similar lifestyles, just as the Cohueltecan and the Karankawas had similar lifestyles. So by knowing about the Karankawa, you could make predictions about the Cohueltecan. Or by knowing about the Caddo, you could make prediction about the way of life of the Wichita and Atakapa. You're going to focus on where they're located, what part of Texas they lived in. This might be a clue, Western Gulf. This, however, is not. So the Southeastern here actually refers to the southeastern part of the United States and the fact that these Native American tribes have a relationship to Native American tribes from outside of Texas. So, location in Texas. Housing means what kind of houses did they live in? And so, using some of our vocabulary words that I introduced earlier, did they live in permanent houses or were they nomads? Did they live in a wigwam or a teepee? Did they use adobe? So you're going to use words like that in your description of the type of houses that were representative of the Southeastern culture or the Western Gulf culture. Food sources. How did they eat? Is where they lived going to have an impact on how they are able to get food? So again, although there might be some differences between the Cohueltecan and the Karankawas, as you read about the Karankawas, you're going to find information that would be true of the Cohueltecans as well. Same thing with the Caddo, Wichita, and Atakapa. And then finally, the unique customs, that actually might be something that would be different for each tribe. But again, since you are focusing only on the Karankawa and the Caddo, you only have to worry about them. Just be aware that maybe the Wichita or the Atakapa had somewhat different customs, although they might again have been similar. So what do I mean by unique customs? Well, what did they do, wear, look like, create, that makes them stand out from the other Native American tribes? So, for example, the Karankawa are going to use a certain animal to create a type of mosquito repellent. Well, why would they do that? Well, here's a clue. They lived by the Gulf, and mosquitoes tended to be particularly bad in that area, so they had to come up with something. The Caddo are going to be famous for something that they build as part of their religion. So you'll be looking for information along those lines in order to describe the life of the Southeastern culture and the life of the Western Gulf culture. Very quickly, I'm going to show you the answer key to this chart. Obviously, I hand wrote those in. Let's not have any comments about my handwriting. Location, housing, food, unique customs. Now, part of the issue here, of course, is that I was trying to write about 2 tribes in one box, or 3 tribes in one box. But in any case, the information that is here shows you what I'm looking for. Okay. The next thing I want you to look at is the side-by-side comparison of the regions with the Native Americans, so that you can begin to see that if the Karankawas are living along this area, they may have a totally different lifestyle from the Jamanos who are over here, or even the Caddos. Now, all of this is the coastal plains, but if you're living right along the coast, where you're near the water of the Gulf of Mexico, you may have something slightly different going on than the ones who are further inland. So the idea here is for you to understand and to be able to answer these questions. How did a culture's location influence their food sources? How did a culture's location influence a culture's housing? I'm very fond of saying, and you'll probably hear me say it more than once, where you live affects how you live. Okay? So as you move on into the lesson, you're going to be responsible for finding information, again, focusing on the Karankawa, their location, their food choices, their housing, and any other important information about their lifestyle. And then you're also going to focus on the Caddo and the same topics: housing, location, food sources, and anything that kind of makes them stand out as an individual tribe. You will not be filling in a chart. You instead will be opening up a Google document in the assignment, and you will be writing a description. Now, after you've watched the videos and you have read the articles that are there and you've read your textbook, you should be able to take all of that information and describe to me how these 2 Native American tribes lived. You'll only open up one Google Doc. You will write about the first people group. And I really don't care whether you do Western Gulf first or Southeastern first. Just make sure that you label it so that I can tell that you know what you're talking about. And then you will write at least 2 paragraphs. You may write more, but you have to have at least 2 paragraphs that help you answer this question. How did a culture's location influence their food sources? How did a culture's location influence their housing? You're going to basically tell me about these tribes, where they're living, and how they're living. Now, I'm going to put a copy of this row with no information in it for you to remember what to focus on. Location, where do they live? Housing, what kind of houses do they live in? Food sources, how did they get the food that their people ate? And then unique customs. I will have that in the assignment directions